Richard Branson, Michael Phelps, Justin Timberlake, James Carville. Wait a minute. Where are the women? Greta Gerwig, Lisa Ling, Audra McDonald, Simone Biles. That sounds like a list of highly successful titans in a variety of industries. They all have ADHD, but you don't hear much about that now, do you? You know what else you don't hear about? Are the 43% of people with ADHD who are in excellent mental health. Why aren't we talking about them and what they're doing right? I'm your host, Tracy Otsuka, and that's exactly what we do here. I'm a lawyer, not a doctor, a lifelong student, and now the author of my new book, ADHD for Smartass Women. I'm also a certified ADHD coach and the creator of Your ADHD Brain is A-OK, a patented system that helps ADHD women just like you get unstuck and fall in love with their brilliant brains. Here, we embrace our too muchness and we focus on our strengths. My guests and I credit our ADHD for some of our greatest gifts. And to those who still think they're too much, too impulsive, too scattered, too disorganized, I say, no one ever made a difference by being too little. Hello, I am your host, Tracy Otsuka. Thank you so much for joining me here for another episode of ADHD for Smartass Women. You know that my purpose is always to show you who you are and then inspire you to be it. In the thousands of ADHD women that I have had the privilege of meeting, I've never met a one that wasn't truly brilliant at something, not one. So, of course, I am just delighted to introduce you to Dr. Idit. Dr. Idit Hazan is a professor of biology at Grandview University in Des Moines, Iowa, where she has been teaching genetics, molecular biology, and biotechnology for the past 20 years. She also advises undergraduate students, many of whom are pre-meds and pre-dentals. Dr. Hazan earned her PhD at the University of California, Irvine. That's where my brother went. And her Bachelor of Science in Biotechnology and Food Engineering at the Technion Institute of Technology. Dr. Idit Hazan lives in West Des Moines with her husband and has 3 grown children, all of whom are currently in college. Oh, joy. I can imagine those bells. She enjoys reading, traveling, and doing various arts and crafts. Welcome, Idit. Did I get all of that right?
Yes, you did.
Wonderful. So I wanted to tell our listeners how you ended up here on our podcast, if I might. So Idit sent me an email where she argued that it was her belief that ADHD behavior was a normal variant and not a disorder. And you know, I totally subscribe to that philosophy. So of course, I wanted to have her on. And we're going to get into that in a bit. But you also know that I always want to connect you to our guests by asking her to share her ADHD story. My understanding, Idit, is you don't have a formal diagnosis and You're not quite sure that you'll ever get one because you feel, why bother? I'm so high functioning. But I'd love for you to tell our audience about the Instagram post about ADHD where you said to yourself, this describes me exactly.
So that's exactly what I happened, browsing on Instagram like one does. And a post shows up about ADHD and I'm looking at that. I'm thinking that describes me exactly. So I go on and I find this, do I have ADHD? And it brings up this questionnaire and I do the questionnaire and it says, you probably have ADHD. And I'm like, yeah, they're probably trying to sell me something. So I call my mom and I say, Mom, I saw this post and I think I might have ADHD. And she's like, you don't have ADHD. That's nonsense. Everybody's like that. Mm-hmm. And so then I look on the internet and I see at least 10 people who describe the exact same conversation they had with their parents saying, Mom, I think I have ADHD. And the mom's like, no, everybody's like that. And so, ADHD is very, very genetic. So it's possible that you grew up in a household where your parent with ADHD and what you consider normal is maybe not normal in other households. So So that's kind of where it stands. And then obviously when you start getting interested in that, the universe sends you all these additional posts and you start reading stuff and you're like, wow, this is really describing me. I got your book, I read your book and some other books and thought, okay, I don't really need medication. I don't need really an intervention. But it just kind of made me think about the genetics of it. And as you know, people with ADHD always want to research stuff, especially if it's more interesting than grading papers, for example. And so you go off on this tangent and into all these journal articles, and there you are, like reading all this stuff about ADHD. So,
And I think you are the perfect example of not needing medication because you are doing what you are passionate about and love, right?
yeah, yes, exactly. And I have a lot of autonomy in my job as well. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, the freedom to be Idit.
Yes, exactly.
So I'm curious, what were you like as a child?
So I was actually a very good student always, and that's why I never thought there was anything wrong with me. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with me, but
Yeah.
I was a good student. I was very, very messy. My mom it would drive her nuts, but very messy. My house is still messy. I cannot seem to get it under control. My office is messy, so I can't even blame my kids on it because, but I was a very good student. I do tend to get very hyper focused on things and take note of a lot of little things that I think people are not taking notice of. I have a very hard time multitasking. Like when I get into something, they had a lot of people on Instagram have this thing where the woman's looking at Instagram and then her husband's laying on the stairs and he's like half dead. Oh, I was supposed to call 911. I forgot. So that's exactly what happens to me. I get on something and I'm like dead to the world, which is horrible, but it is what it is. So that's kind of, how I was. But I was always very, I did well in school. I got my PhD, so I was able to do all this stuff. But yeah, super disorganized in my, messiness. Always interested in researching a million things, doing a lot of different arts and crafts projects. Interested in everything, but eventually you have to pick something. So that's kind of how I was, I guess, as a child.
So, did you struggle with your dissertation?
I did not struggle with my dissertation. That's one of the interesting things is that, I mean, for me, my feeling is that I can do 95% of the work that other people do in about 50% of the time.
I love that.
But the last 5% is never going to get done.
Yeah.
And so, it's just not my strength finding the little errors or the polishing or that stuff. I just can't do that stuff. But I can do the 95% of the time much faster than most people. So when I was finishing my PhD and we had to set a date for the dissertation, my PhD thesis advisor said, let's set a date. And it ended up being like 6 weeks. And she said, you can't write your dissertation in 6 weeks. And I said, I'm going to write my dissertation in 6 weeks, which is a culmination of 4 or 5 years of research. And I did because I had a schedule. And like I said, but the polishing stuff, that's just beyond me. I can't do that stuff. I need somebody else to help me with that. And I think I've stopped beating myself up on it. Like, oh, I always send an email. There's always a typo. I mean, it is what it is. But that's not my strength.
So we have a phrase around here that I always joke around. Don't be a 97% finisher, because then you're going to have this graveyard of all these 97% things around you that they've got the 3% left. And so how do you get to that? Because obviously you didn't do your dissertation. You didn't get it done 97%, right? You had to get it done 100%. So what do you do to that last oomph to make it happen?
Well, I mean, if somebody else has to polish it, edit it, look at it, make comments, I would get these, it was in those days we were still writing on paper. I would get these sheets that were blood red from all the comments that my thesis advisor had. She said, you should be a novelist. But science writing, which is supposed to be very short and dry, that's not your forte. And I was like, fine, fair enough. So, people helped me with polishing it. And I mean, it was all there. It was just like the last details that were missing.
So it sounds like when it's important, you will have structures and systems built around you to get you to the end.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's where I really shine when situations where things need to get fast in a short period of time. I will do it much faster than other people. For example, there was some tests I took as an undergraduate. Sometimes the professor writes the test too long for the test period. And so in those cases, when they see that nobody could finish the test, they're pretty lenient about the details, and in that case, I would get, I'd get the highest score in the class by like 20 points because I got through most of it, not polished. Maybe there's little math mistakes and stuff, but I got through it where everybody else was like halfway through. So those are the situations in which I'm like, I really do well.
Did you wonder, like then, like why do I get the highest grade in this instance, but then I don't in that instance? And I'm putting the same amount of effort in.
I mean, I don't know. I just know that I'm pretty quick, like with things, with reaching conclusions. And sometimes it's not good because sometimes you write an email and you write it really quickly, and then you're like, maybe I shouldn't have sent that email. I should have. And so my practice now is I usually don't send emails right away. I keep them in my box for a little bit, and then I read it the next day, and I'm like, yeah, I probably should not send this email.
I have a rule now. It has to sit in there for 24 hours before I
and I think
send it.
that's a good rule.
Yeah. Yeah. So can you tell the story about COVID? Because I know that most professors, most teachers were struggling during COVID, but you, on the other hand.
So what had happened with COVID is, you all know, we all closed down. We went to online, and we basically were told that you're going to have to teach online. We had to pivot with this technology, and I'm really good in a crisis. That's one of the things. And so I took the summer, I recorded all of my lectures. I did what we call a flipped classroom, in which the students watched the lectures outside and we solved problems in class. Like, I got so much done during COVID because we couldn't go anywhere. And it just was an excellent time to do this thing. It was like lack of excuses. I got nothing else to do. So I think I really do thrive in a crisis, and I kind of that type of thing. I don't know if that's necessarily an ADHD thing.
Oh, it totally is. It totally is because of interest, right? And
yeah.
So would you consider yourself high energy, hyperactive, or would you consider yourself more inattentive, like in your head all the time?
That's a tough question because I think I am, I can't sit still. I can't take a vacation where you sit on the beach and do nothing.
Yeah.
We take vacations where we're doing
Yes.
like 50 things. I love planning vacations, sometimes more than the vacation itself, by the way, like researching and all that. But I am able to work and get focused. But I almost feel like one of the things I feel like is, when people, the focus is because I'm so easily distracted that I have to channel all my energy to focusing. It's like, don't talk to me right now. I'm like, I'm in the moment. And so I don't know what do you think this would be? Is that the hyperactive, or is that?
I have never met anyone that is purely hyperactive. I've been told there are people like that, but literally in the thousands of people that I've met, never met anyone that didn't have a little bit of the hyperactivity of the brain, right? So the inattention. Are you inattentive on, like, will you start working on, it sounds like you've already told me you are, but let me give you an example. You start working on something, you're working on it, and, you're walking around at the same time trying to get this thing done, and then all of a sudden you lose your glasses or you lose your phone and you find it in the refrigerator or you find it somewhere else. You weren't in your body, so you can't retrace your steps.
Totally. Yeah. And I have to, if I put something to cook on the stove and I go do something, if I don't put a timer, it's going to get burnt. I mean, there's like, how many eggs I've burned, like hard-boiled eggs. So, I mean, I just have to, and, I try to do all these multi things. And I, by the time I went up to get this and I didn't get this. If there's not a list to the supermarket, if it's not a list, it's not going to get purchased because I will forget.
Yeah.
And, all of those things. So yeah, I mean, I do kind of forget where I am sometimes when I'm doing stuff.
Totally. So what about interrupting other people?
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, interrupting other people. My kids say I have an inability to stand in line. I always feel like I need to tell the store how they would run their business more efficiently if they did this, that, and the other. And that my kids will just stand in line. What's the problem? I can't stand anything long-winded, long-winded talks, long-winded restaurant service, all this stuff. It's like, come on, let's go, let's get moving.
Yeah.
We're burning daylight here. So, let's just move on.
How are you with your sleep? Because you sound just like me.
I mean, I guess it's not great. It's okay. I sleep okay.
Is the not great because you can't get yourself into bed, or do you struggle to stay asleep, get to sleep?
Probably get to sleep. Lots of thoughts, in your head. And yeah.
But you go to bed at a normal time.
I do. I try.
Well, that's really good.
Okay.
I wish I was more like you. You've already told us you prefer more active experiences, can't sit on a beach. My kids get so upset because whenever we go anywhere, I'm like, okay, I can do maybe 2 days for a couple hours, but then we've got all these things planned and they just want to hang out. But I have to tell you, Idit, whenever we go to, do any of these like active type things, that's always the best part of the trip for them. So it's hard to kind of drag them over there, but then once they're there, they're so happy they did it.
Yeah, I agree.
Is that how your family is too?
Yeah. Yep. We've recently become empty nesters, so we travel a little bit without the kids, and we go even faster because, we don't have to worry so much about who's eating what and who's getting tired. We just like go, 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 go.
Yeah. So, the reason, obviously, I invited Idit to talk to us is because I really love her perspective on ADHD. She approaches it, and I hope I'm using the right words, but you'll correct me if I'm not. You approach it from a genetic and evolutionary viewpoint. Would that be true?
Yes.
So, what can you tell us about the actual genetics of ADHD since this is what you teach?
Yeah. So I kind of got interested and I went to see, what is the heritability of ADHD.
Yeah.
And the way that it was usually traditionally done was by twin studies. So you
Mm-hmm.
look at identical twins and you compare how similar they are versus not identical twins that are just siblings. And of course, you see that it runs in families. And actually, when you look at that, there's about an 80% heritability, which is probably the highest of any psychological disorder. So it's
Yeah.
from all you can think of, schizophrenia, any type of psychological or neurological, 80% is very, very high.
Mm-hmm.
However, when DNA came into the picture and they started doing studies where they're looking at genes and saying, can we narrow down what are the genes that cause ADHD and how are the differences between individuals, the numbers were much, much lower. They're about at 20%, which is a huge discrepancy. So people are still kind of puzzled. I don't know that there's a really good explanation. Probably the best explanation is that there's so many genes involved in ADHD. And so
Ah.
it's not like you have a gene for ADHD. There could be 30. Each one of them is contributing a tiny little bit, and everybody might have a different combination. One person might have these 10 types of genes and the other person have these 15. So the overlaps are not as much. And that's one thing. The second thing is very underdiagnosed. So we're probably not getting everybody who has ADHD. So, that's why it's complicated. But it's definitely genetic. It's definitely runs in families. And you have a much higher chance of getting, having ADHD if somebody in your family has it. So,
That's so interesting. So, you know that DRD4, I always call it the travel gene. So, what you're saying is there is really only a 20% chance that you will see that in someone's genetic profile that also has ADHD?
it's a little more complicated that what it's saying is that when I have individuals and I'm trying to figure out based on genetic markers how many of the genetic markers they share with their parents or their family, it's a lot lower than 80%. It's 20%. So it is much lower than that. And there's just like so many genes involved. And the genetics is not really worked out. One of the things I came upon was, will there ever be a genetic test that you could
Mm,
test someone and say, you have ADHD or you will
yeah.
have ADHD? And the answer to that is no, not currently. But they are developing something where you could get like a risk. It's called a polygenetic risk assessment. And they're doing it now for, like, for example, if you went to get a mammogram, you notice that now they give you this thing where based upon all these factors put together, your chance of getting the disease is this much or that much more than the regular, than general population. So maybe we'll have a PRS, that polygenetic risk factor, but we're probably not going to have, not anytime soon, like yes, no, do you have ADHD based on your genes? Like we'll sequence your genome and tell you whether you have ADHD without. It's still behavioral. The diagnosis still has to be behavioral.
Do we know all of the genes that are involved in ADHD?
Probably not. There's a
Mm,
whole list of genes. Some have a stronger association, some have a very weak association. It gets super complicated when you start to get into the details. But I will mention that when I was reading up, I did bump into the DRD4 gene because the DRD4 gene is like a thrill-seeking gene. You know, those
yeah.
people who love to do bungee jump and do all
Yeah.
this stuff. And so the DRD gene is rather simple, and it's easy to trace how it happens because it's a receptor for dopamine. Yes, sorry. So it's a receptor for dopamine. And so if you have a weaker receptor, you need more dopamine to activate it. So it makes sense that you would have to jump out of a plane to get that dopamine, or most of us can just go shopping and it's like sufficient for us. So that's a pretty simple mechanism. ADHD is not like that. But people who have the DRD4 gene are more likely to have ADHD. I certainly found that to be true. There's also a whole bunch of comorbidities that go with ADHD. So, and some, I mean, not most of them, I'm going to pull up my list. Most of them are, some of them I think you could probably come up with yourself, but some of them are just kind of interesting. So, things that are common for people with ADHD, obesity is one of them. Basically, willingness to try new things. There's some sort of a link to smoking, hypertension, asthma, migraines, type 2 diabetes. I'm going to assume that the type 2 diabetes has to do with the obesity. Maybe, I don't know.
Well, yeah, and just eating habits, right? And
Yeah, eating habits and just like being excited about,
yeah.
delicious food. So all these things are things that are considered comorbid with ADHD. So I found that to be kind of interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess the question is how many of them are actually caused by ADHD? Like when I think of like anxiety, which is probably the number one comorbidity, well, in truth, I don't think I've ever met anyone with ADHD who doesn't have at least have a little bit of anxiety, right? Because you grow up kind of wondering about these things that you're so different than your peers.
Yeah.
So that makes sense to me. So my next question is, why does it make sense from an evolutionary perspective for a certain percentage of the population to have ADHD traits? And why do you think these traits have persisted in the gene pool?
So there's something called mismatch theory, and mismatch theory means that we are living in times that our genome doesn't match the surrounding.
Yeah.
So if you think about hunters gatherers, it makes sense. You always need somebody who's hyper vigilant, always aware of their surrounding, notices everything, can do all this stuff. And our circumstances, at least in the last 100 or years or even 1,000 years, have changed much faster than DNA. DNA changes, genetic changes take thousands, if not, hundreds of thousands of years to change. And so basically we're living in a world that doesn't match our genetics. So it used to be an advantage.
Starting to.
Well, and it's not,
The
I mean,
internet.
I don't think it's necessarily a disadvantage, but
Yeah.
it just explains it. The other thing is you need all sorts of people in society, right? You need the accountant that can, you need the person who can make sure that everything, and then you need the people who will try new things. One of the things that they said was a couple of things with people with ADHD, and like think about hunter-gatherers, novelty seeking, trying to find new places to live, new food sources, things like that, more successful earlier reproduction. That's good for
Mm.
evolution. So all of these things kind of make sense to me that there would be a trait that's a positive trait, not a negative trait. Now, if you have to sit in an hour meeting, then it's difficult for you. But I don't imagine that hunter-gatherers had to do that. So that kind
Yeah.
of explains, the whole situation, why there's no match.
Yeah. And that they're just in the wrong environment. So, I mean, what I'm always
Exactly.
preaching is get yourself in the right environment, right career, right people around you, right intimate relationships, all the things that you can control. And then life is so much easier, right?
Yeah. And I think like, don't feel bad about the fact that you're not good at this because you're good at something else. I've had in my career been asked to do all sorts of, will you do this or will you join this task force? And I know I'm going to be bad at it. Like, I know this is not my forte. So don't feel bad, find a reason, explain why you don't want to do it. And just, this is not my strength. I'm not the person for this job. I can do something else, but I can't do this. Like, don't ask me to wordsmith something to the nth degree and find all the missing commas because I can't do it. So it's not going to happen.
Yeah. So get people around you who are good at that, right?
Yeah. I mean, somebody else is good at that. It doesn't necessarily have to be me, right? So,
What about this idea that, and it's more than an idea, so it looks like, studies show that 5 to 7% of kids in the world have ADHD. But in the United States and Canada, I think too, it's 8 to 10% of the population. I've heard about people have more ADHD the farther they are from East Asia because of migration and, traits like impulsivity and high energy and novelty seeking likely helped our hunter-gatherers adapt, right? Especially in more challenging settings. So the further they are from East Asia, the more likely that they're going to have developed those kinds of traits. Does that make sense to you?
I think it does. I also think it might be a diagnosis thing. We have access to a lot of
Yes.
tools. We have, parents that are very kind of looking for that. It's talked about. And so I think that's where you get that higher percentage from, just because of diagnosis. I'm sure there's other people in those other places that have it and have not been diagnosed just because there's other stuff going on, or, it's not a priority,
Right.
or it's kind of like, suck it up and you'll be
Yes.
fine. Right?
Yeah.
That kind of attitude. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's a character flaw or a moral failing.
exactly.
So, how does the field of genetics categorize normal versus abnormal. And how does that pertain to ADHD? When you wrote me, you used the word, which I've never heard before.
Wild type.
Wild type, yeah.
Yeah, in genetics, we don't talk about normal or abnormal. What's normal, what's abnormal. But what we have to talk about is what we called wild type. Wild type is, the majority of the population, and then we have mutant, which is the mutation. How do you decide what's, I don't know, I don't want to call it right or wrong, but you know what I'm saying? Like, how do you decide what's wild type and what's not wild type?
Yeah.
So when I tell my students in genetics, the line passes at 1%. If it's over 1% of the population has a trait, it's considered wild type or normal, if you want to call it. And that makes sense if you think about it in the context of genetic diseases. So, a person to carry the cystic fibrosis gene, it's 1 in 30,000. So 1 in 30,000 is 0.0000 something, right? So it makes sense that that's the abnormal, and a person who doesn't have cystic fibrosis is wild type or normal. That's how we define.
So wild type is actually synonymous with normal.
Normal.
Because I thought wild type was the other.
No. Wild type is normal. And again, as much as you could define what normal is, wild type, but what's found in the wild has not been affected by a mutation. Yes. So if you put the number at 1% and ADHD is 5 to 7% or 8 to 10%, then that's considered a normal variant. I know that percentage is based on diagnosis and on genes, but still, if you think about, I think the best example to explain is blood groups, right? So if somebody has blood group AB, they're at about 1% of the population. Nobody thinks that if you have AB blood type, there's something wrong with you or that you're not normal. It's a normal variant, but it's just a little more rare than the other blood types. But it's still considered normal because it's just right above that 1% line. So that's how we define it in biology. In genetics, if it's over 1%, it's considered normal or wild type. And if it's under 1%, it's considered, a variant or mutation or something like that. So it just makes sense to me that when you think about ADHD, that it makes sense that you're going to need those people in your midst, right? The risk takers, the ones that are willing to try new stuff. In my school, anytime they need, will somebody try this? I'm like, I'll try it because I get bored with what I'm doing. So I have to try new stuff all the time. But not everybody's comfortable with that. And that's okay. Everybody has their strength and they need to kind of lean onto those.
Yeah. You need people that are moving society forward instead of hanging on to, let's not have any change at all, right?
Yeah. And now that's not saying if somebody, feels like they need help and intervention in terms of medication or therapy or whatever, I think that's perfectly fine. But like you said, you said you don't like to make this a pathology necessarily. I think it's like a superpower. And I read somewhere said, don't call it a superpower. It's just like you're minimizing other people. But for me, it's always been something that's been helpful to me and not like a detriment.
It's why you're successful.
Yeah. And another thing that really resonated with me, I read this thing on LinkedIn. Somebody said with ADHD, difficult things are easy and easy things are difficult. And I think that's so true because, I got my PhD, I got tenure while I had 3, babies. Easy. Getting my desk organized.
It's boring. Anybody can do that.
I mean, it's just, so difficult things are easy and easy things are difficult. And I think that's probably true.
Yeah. I love that. I mean, how I've always felt is if 8 to 10% of a population has anything, how can it be a disorder? Isn't that just a variation on normal?
That's what I think. And that's how, I kind of look at it. And I think it goes back to, me calling my mom and saying, I think I have ADHD. And she was like, there's nothing wrong with you. You're fine. And I'm like, yeah, I guess I'm fine. But I do have these, I think, characteristics that are different. So you have to know your strengths and weaknesses, and you have to do stuff that helps you, maximize your strength and maybe find workarounds around your weaknesses.
Or delegate them if you can.
Or delegate them if you can.
If you can get to the point where you're just, because nobody is brilliant focusing on their weaknesses, getting better in their weaknesses. That is not where you're brilliant, right?
Exactly.
So focus on your strengths, where you're brilliant, and then shore up your weaknesses, hopefully by getting people to help you in those areas that you struggle. I mean, you can't always do that, right?
But you can't always, and I don't think that you need to be embarrassed of those things. It's just, this is how you are. And, I think this generation, I see kind of my kids' generation, they're a lot better at admitting and taking care of their mental health.
Yes.
There's less of a stigma. It's okay to be different. It's okay to have issues that you work on. And I think we can learn from them in those instances.
I
instead of
totally
pretending
agree.
that everything's perfect.
My son's in New York City, and I know, like, when I was, his age, oh my gosh, we would have never admitted if we went to therapy or, we're seeing anybody for mental health. Versus he made the comment, like, they're all like, well, how much do you pay? And how, like, he's like, everybody's got a therapist. Part of that is New York City. But I also think a lot of it is just they've normalized this. What
Hmm.
is wrong with talking about people and having someone to process, thoughts, emotions, etc. with? It's so much healthier than what we did.
Hmm.
So I'm curious, you keep talking about how heritable ADHD is. So where do you think you got it? Like, could it be from your mom who says, no, you're normal?
I don't know. I haven't really thought about that. I guess, yeah, maybe from my mom.
Do any of your kids have these traits?
I think so, but I don't want to
Yeah.
they would be pretty upset if I expose them on air. But yeah, I do see that. But I think it has to do a lot with how you grew up. If you grew up in a house where you're used to
Yes.
on the beach vacations, and that's kind of what you're used to. And if you grew up in a house where, you do things like this is when you do things, then
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times I think until you go out into the real world, you don't realize that that's very unique to your family, and you don't realize
Yeah.
that other people may have grown up very differently. So that's kind of how it happens. You go out and you're like, oh wow, and when you get married, obviously, and you have a spouse, you're like, oh wow, that's different. But I think it's natural to think that what happened in your house is that's how everybody is.
Exactly. So you describe yourself as high functioning, and you're not sure you even need a diagnosis. You've kind of figured it out on your own. How would you recommend others navigate this if they feel they function well but identify with certain ADHD traits?
I mean, you have to find the workarounds that work for you, I think. If a diagnosis is important to you, then for sure go to a doctor and talk to a doctor and get diagnosed. But I think the workarounds are important, like having a system for things, the things that bother you. I mean, some things might not bother you. Like, my house is pretty messy. I think my family's used to it, and it's kind of like it's not a huge deal. So, marry someone who embraces your messiness. I don't know.
And can I ask you, Idit, so much of that is how we're socialized, right?
Yeah,
How, you flip through the magazines and this is what your house is supposed to look like. Do you even care?
not that much.
Yeah.
I mean, I do tidy up before guests come, but
But again, that's like the social structure, right?
yeah,
That's
that's the
working there.
social structure. Yeah. I know where to find everything in my house.
Uh-huh.
It's just like, and in my office and everything, but it's messy. And I've kind of given up on tidying it. It's just too much energy and yeah. I'm never going to have one of those houses where, those magazine not cluttered houses that you see in magazines. It's okay.
Yeah, totally. Oh, so I'm a little bit different in that I call it visual pollution. And if there's anything in my line of sight, I can't focus. And so I have to clean everything up. And so I have a lot of cabinets. But if you opened up the cabinets, it's an ongoing, like trying to make sure that what's behind them is organized and tidy. But at least I don't have to see it. It makes me anxious. And we're all so different, right? So what I want to make sure that our listeners get is that just because you can be the complete opposite. You can be so organized because of the anxiety of seeing this clutter, or so it can really bother you. Or it can be the total opposite where you could care less. Like you're doing just fine, right?
I mean, I would love to have somebody walk behind me and organize my house, but it's not going to happen. So
Yeah. And it seems like it's okay with your brain.
yeah, I mean, I do find myself straightening things out so they're at a right angle, or putting them away because, like you said, it annoys me, to see something that's cluttered, but it never quite gets, completely tidy. I enjoy a tidy house. It's just,
You enjoy other things more.
yeah, exactly.
So, as a professor who might have ADHD, what message would you want students, especially those who are neurodivergent, to take away about learning, curiosity, and success in academics?
I think you can be successful no matter how you are. You just have to, first of all, know yourself. And second of all, ask for help. Because a lot of my students don't ask for help. And I can be a lot of things, but a mind reader is not one of them. And so if you ask for help, and I know not every school is the same and not every professor is as open, but there are going to be people and there are going to be resources that would be able to help you figure it out or study or get some extra help. And you just need to ask for help and figure out what works for you. What works for one person doesn't work for another person. And, studying different things. If you study something that really interests you, then you're more likely to be successful. If you've convinced yourself somehow that you need to be, I don't know, a doctor, but it's not your passion, it's going to be a very tough road. But if you find, and I've had students like that had kind of this idea, like, this is what I want to do. And they were so miserable doing it. And it felt like banging your head against the wall.
Yeah.
And then one day they just took a class in a different, in a different field. And like their whole demeanor changed. It's like, I'm successful. I'm doing what I love. So I think that's really important. Find what your passion is and do that, and ask for help when you're stuck.
I think we all just want to know that the people that are around us, whether they're, our friends or our students, care, right? If you have a student who you see, they're really trying, they're doing their best, you're going to give them a lot more of a break than someone who you just think could care less.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I have to treat all my students the
Right.
same, but there's always help if you need it. There's always that extra word or the extra, you can come to my office. I can help you. I can help you figure out strategy. I always tell students after a test, let's take a look and see what the issue was. Was it vocabulary? Did you just get nervous in the middle of the test and you need to work on like breathing techniques? Did you forget, what was it that tripped you up? And let's figure out what that is and figure that out. So, have students kind of reflect on what went wrong. Because a lot of times people know what went wrong if they spend the time thinking about it a little bit.
Yes, versus beating themselves up and then they're not focusing on what maybe they could try next time.
Yeah. Yes. And, in the sciences, we tend to be very kind of like, here it is, this is what you do. But really, there are different styles of learning. We're not very great at reflection. We tend to not be very touchy-feely in the sciences, but I think reflection is really important. Just sit for a minute and think, try to think. You probably know what went wrong. And I ask my students to reflect on that and write what went wrong. What do you think you should have done? Because and 9 out of 10 times, they know exactly what they should have done. And they'll admit, yeah, I should have studied more and I didn't, or I got really nervous and I didn't eat before the test or whatever. They know what the issue is. So reflection, I think, is really important.
Is there any part in education now when we're talking about grades? Is it simply tests, or is there anything that's a little bit more subjective? Any part of the grade?
Well, it really depends on the discipline. Obviously, when you ask a genetics question, there's an answer that is correct. But a lot of us try to do, a lot of low stake assignments, assignments where they do group work. I know not everybody likes to do group work. It's not just the test, and they write stuff. Obviously, in other disciplines, there's a lot more subjective stuff. The sciences were a little bit limited, but so definitely, I think people are much more aware of differing learning styles and trying to help students of different styles and different neurodivergences to be successful.
So why do you think you're so good at this? Like, you're a really good professor. Obviously you are. You got tenure really early. And are you funny? Do you have lots of energy when you teach? Like, how would your students describe your teaching style?
I think it's the passion and my true love for science. That's what it is, because I'm always like researching stuff, or I always, I post a lot of stuff on LinkedIn that I find really interesting. And I try to bring that into the classroom, and we go off on tangents. We were talking about Diet Coke the other day and PKU, which is a disease. And so, I just really enjoy I think that's the main thing. And the other one is obviously treating people with respect and understanding that people are coming from different backgrounds and different experiences, and kind of being aware of that. So, but I think it's the passion for science. I hope that comes through.
So you have a lot of energy when you're teaching?
Yes.
Which I'm sure your neurodiverse students love you even more, right? Because again, if we have any interest and there's someone there who is passionate about what we're interested in, we want to do everything that we can to, number one, make sure that there's some sort of relationship or connection there.
Yeah.
But also that we're going to try. We're really going to try, because what I have noticed is, I always have said this, I believe that ADHD kids are a barometer for good teaching. Like, we can tell, right, when a teacher is passionate and interested and loves what they're doing versus the teacher who's just kind of phoning it in.
Yes, and one other thing is my experience as a student, the topic matters less than the speaker.
Yes.
If it's a good speaker, I had to take a computer science course, which is really not something I'm interested in. The professor was so funny and so engaging that I enjoyed it. And then somebody could take the most interesting topic and turn it into like a snooze fest. So I feel like, when my kids ask me, should I take this professor or that professor? If you can take someone who's engaging and fun, even if they're not the world's expert on whatever, I think that you would have a better time and you would learn more. Standing there and droning about a topic because you're the number one expert on this topic is maybe it used to work 50 years ago, but I don't think that that's the case anymore.
Yeah, no, I love that. I totally agree. So, in your view, how does society benefit from neurodiverse individuals, including those with ADHD, especially when it comes to innovation and change?
So, those are going to be the people who are going to try new stuff, who are going to, and some of it works and some of it doesn't. Over the years, I've tried a lot of things in my teaching and some of them worked and some of them didn't. But I think the innovators, kind of the risk takers, I think that's really helpful. I think this hyper awareness, I always, when I'm in a crowd, I always kind of take note of other people's kids. I don't have young kids anymore, but I'm always like, and I never want to say anything, but it's like, that kid's too close to the sidewalk. That kid's going to fall. I mean, it's just like hyper aware. So I think having, people who are hyper aware is important. And, somebody needs to be watching around while the other people are oblivious to what's happening, right? So I think that's another plus.
I love that. So do you have a number one workaround?
Notes, lists on everything, calendar reminders for everything. So if I'm here and I see, I need to bring cups for my office or spoons or whatever for my lunches, if I don't put myself a reminder that's going to ring at 6 p.m. at home, it's not going to happen. So I have a reminder on the phone at 6 p.m. The phone rings and say, bring cups and spoons to the office. And I know we have an issue with object displacement.
I know what you mean, where you don't see it. Object permanence.
Or you forget people. It's not that I'm going to apologize to my family and friends. I have reminders on my phone to call people. So I write myself reminders because it's not that I don't want to call that person. So by the time I get around to it, it's too late to call.
Yeah.
So I have a reminder at a reasonable time so that I will remember to call that person. Because I get so caught up in other stuff that I just like, the day's gone and I didn't call again.
Yeah.
And then the next day it happens again. So I have reminders, call this person, call that person. That's my workaround, and lists for everything.
Can I ask you, with the calling, is that hard for you in terms of there's only so many hours in the day? You want to do that thing. You want to call that person, but at least for me, I cannot have a 5-minute conversation. And so what I tend to do is I keep putting it off because once I get there, then I can't stop talking to them, Do you struggle with that? And so I'm not good on the phone. I used to be as a teenager, but now it's like my least favorite thing. I'd rather be in person because it's an appointment and it tends to be after office hours, right? I'm curious.
I like to talk and get the information and ask stuff and find out stuff and how people are doing, and then I'm ready to move on. So I can't do like long-winded conversations, and sometimes it's just kind of like, okay, love you, bye.
So you're good at ending the conversation.
Yeah, because I have 50 other things to do and they're all calling at me all the time. So yeah, but I don't know. I mean, I think people that are like my friends and my family know, I hope they don't think I'm abrupt or anything, and that it's coming for a good place. It's just, that's how I am. I'm like ready to move on. We've talked to everything. Let's go. So yeah.
The other thing that you said that's interesting to me, though, is I think you said this, or maybe you wrote it in in the email, is you do not struggle with time at all, right? You're really good with time management.
I'm good with time. I'm always on time. So I don't, and that's one of the things that's not typical of ADHD people. I'm always on time. I'm a person who's on time. I know how to plan time, and we always joke. We can, me and my husband, we can. Like we went to visit our son in Texas. We said, we'll be in Texas around 5. And we were at the hotel at 5:00. It just happened that way. So we're really good with organizing time. So that has not been a struggle for me, being on time.
And that is huge because time affects everything. So it's interesting that but you know what? You're very much like my son. My son isn't on time. He is always 5 minutes or 10 minutes early.
I am too most of the time.
Yeah. So, yes, there are people with ADHD that are great with time. Unfortunately, I'm not one of them.
And that's okay.
And I think when you're good with time, it makes everything else easier.
It is. I think my executive functioning is pretty good because of the list. If you look at my desk, I have like 50 lists on my desk. But once I write it down, I feel like that helps me remember it more. So through writing it down, I then remember. Yeah, time is a huge thing. be on time.
I love it. Dr. Idit, if people want to know more about you, is there a place they can go?
I am on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter, but I don't usually use it as a platform for anything. So
Okay.
I'm just a college professor doing their job.
Well, I love that you're a college professor doing your job and can relate to this whole ADHD experience and teach us about genetics and evolution and all of that, which I think the more information we have that points to you are not disordered, you are just different. How can that not help you?
Exactly. And don't beat yourself up because you have strength that other people don't have, and you have weaknesses where they have, they're better at it. They're just better at it. So what?
Yeah. What would you want to be better at? The moving things forward, the ideas, the innovation, or keeping things exactly the way they are, right?
I'd love it if I could multitask, but...
But they've proven that nobody really does well multitasking, right?
That's
so it's
true.
not just us.
That's true.
Anyway, Dr. Idit, it was such a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you.
So that's what I have for you for this week. If you like this episode with Dr. Idit, please let us know by leaving a review. Our goal is to change the conversation around ADHD, helping as many women as we possibly can learn how their ADHD brain works so they too may discover their amazing strengths. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you here next week. You've been listening to the ADHD for Smartass Women podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Otsuka. Join us at ADHDforsmartwomen.com, where you can find more information on my new book, ADHD for Smartass Women, and my patented Your ADHD Brain is A-OK system to help you get unstuck and fall in love with your brilliant brain.